$15 was what they asked for her. $15, a jug of rye, and a mule that was half lame by the look of it. Sable didn't know any of that at the time. She only knew the cold, and the man standing at the edge of the crowd who wasn't laughing. Everyone else was laughing. It was the kind of market that happened twice a year in Coldwater Flats, out past the spruce line where the Northwest Territories bled into nothing, and no one was keeping careful track of what was bought or sold or handed off between rough hands in the October mud. There were pelts and grain and tools and horses, and sometimes there were people, women, mostly, dressed up in the language of debt. Her father had called it a labor contract. He had used those exact words, standing in their cabin doorway, not quite meeting her eyes. Labor contract, like she was a harrow, like she was a sack of flour that had outlasted its usefulness. She had not fought him on it. That was the thing she would carry longest, that she hadn't fought. She had been 23 years old, and so tired of fighting already. 3 years of hard winters since her mother died. 3 years of her father drinking away whatever they'd managed to put by. She had fought and bargained and reasoned, and eventually she had stopped because it made no difference. And when a person stops fighting, they start to look a little like what the world has decided they are. Small, dispensable, worth $15 and a lame mule. The man at the edge of the crowd was named Everard. She found that out later. He was not the sort of man you'd call handsome. He was the sort of man you noticed, the way you noticed a stone wall. Something solid that had been standing so long. It seemed like it had always been there, big through the shoulders, weathered past, guessing his age, with a dark beard going to grey and hands that looked like they'd been used hard and put away rough. He wore a canvas coat and didn't have a hat on despite the cold, which struck her as strange later when she thought back on it. Everyone else had their collars up and their hats pulled down. Everard just stood there in the wind with his dark eyes watching. He bought her. She didn't know what to do with that sentence at the time. He bought her. The auction wasn't really an auction. It was 3 men in muddy boots making jokes she couldn't follow, and her father accepting something handed from a leather pouch. She didn't hear the transaction. She just saw her father step back and the big man step forward, and he said, very quietly, so that only she could hear, "My wagon's at the end of the row. We're leaving when you're ready." When you're ready. As though she had a say in the matter. As though he didn't know he'd just paid $15 and a promise she hadn't been consulted on. She walked to the wagon. What else was there? The drive out of Coldwater Flats took 2 hours, and neither of them said a word for most of it. She sat on the bench beside him, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled like pine resin and old leather, watching the spruce close in around the road and the sky go the color of pewter, and she tried to calculate what she was going to do, what a person like her, a woman with no money, no family worth having, no horse and no coat that fit right, was supposed to do with the particular kind of freedom that looked a lot like the absence of other options. He stopped the wagon once when they crossed a creek bed that had gone swampy from the early melt, and he got down and led the horse through by hand rather than whipping the animal over. She noticed that. "What's your name?" he asked when he climbed back up. "Sable," she said. He didn't react to the name, didn't say it was unusual or ask where it came from, just nodded and shook the reins. "Everard," he said, and that was that. His cabin was another hour north, up a track that wasn't really a road, so much as a suggestion. 2 ruts worn through the moss by the same wheels over many years, winding between the big spruce and the birch stands that had already gone bare and yellow. The cabin appeared out of the trees without warning. It was larger than she'd expected. Solid. The logs were chinked tight, and the roof looked sound, and there was a wood pile stacked along the south wall that was taller than she was, and 20 feet wide. A man who put up a wood pile like that did not expect to need rescuing. He showed her where she'd sleep. A loft above the main room, with a rope ladder and a straw tick. and 2 folded blankets that were clean. And he showed her where the water was, and where the outhouse stood, and where he kept the extra lamp oil. He didn't touch her. He didn't leer at her. He said, "I'll need help with the curing and the trapping lines come freeze up. I'll show you what I need," she said, "and after the winter." He looked at her steadily. "Then you decide." She didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. Those first 2 weeks were the strangest of her life. Stranger, even, than the market at Coldwater Flats. She had expected something ugly, and she kept waiting for it the way you keep waiting for thunder after the lightning. Every morning she woke in the loft and lay still for a moment, listening, calculating whether the sound of him moving below was something to be afraid of. Every morning it was only the stove lid or boots on the board floor or the door swinging open and the cold coming in with him as he went to see to the horse. He was teaching her things. That was the thing she couldn't get her footing on. He taught her how to stretch and stake a beaver, pelt without tearing the membrane, how to check a snare line and reset it, how to read the snow for animal tracks, and what each print meant about where the animal had been going and how long ago. He did not explain why he was teaching her. She didn't ask. She began to think maybe he was just lonely, not in any weak way, not in the way of a man who needed someone to talk at, more in the way of a person who had been alone long enough, that they'd stopped noticing it, the ways you stop noticing the sound of your own heartbeat. And having someone else in the space was something they were still working out how to accommodate. He'd hand her the coffee first in the mornings without seeming to think about it. He'd leave the better lamp on her side of the room when he was reading. Small things. Habits that had adjusted for her, without any visible decision being made. She started to wonder who he'd been before the trap line, before the cabin, before whatever had put that particular expression on his face when he thought no one was looking. Not sadness exactly, more like a man who had looked at something once and decided never to look at it directly again. The freeze-up came in the 2nd week of November and came hard, the way it does up north. Not a gradual cooling, but a hammer blow that locked the creek overnight and drove the temperature down past anything she'd seen in Coldwater Flats. Everard moved the horse into the lean-to off the cabin's east wall and banked the fire higher, and they settled into the particular winter rhythm of a place where the cold outside is not a season so much as a presence, something living that presses against the walls and tests the seams. He went out on the line every 3 days regardless of weather. She went with him when it was above -30. When it wasn't, she stayed and kept the fire and worked the pelts and had something hot waiting when he came back through the door, half frozen and white around the ears. She didn't let herself think about what that looked like from the outside. She didn't let herself think about what it was starting to look like from the inside either. The accident happened on the 23rd of November. She knew the date because she'd been marking them on the cabin wall with a piece of charcoal, small notches above the window frame where he wouldn't notice. It was a thing she did to keep herself anchored. Proof that time was still moving, that the winter was not permanent, that there was still a calendar beyond the spruce and the snow. He had gone out on the eastern line alone because she'd woken with a cough that had settled in her chest, and he'd looked at her in the morning light and said simply, "Not today," in the tone of a man accustomed to making decisions about conditions. She had wanted to argue. She'd let him go. He came back 3 hours later without the toboggan. She knew something was wrong from the way the door opened. Not the usual solid push of a man comfortable in his own threshold, but slower, a shoulder against the wood, an unsteadiness. She was off the stool before he was all the way inside, and she could see from where she stood that his face was the wrong color, and he was holding his left arm at a strange angle, and there was blood on his beard that had already dried dark in the cold. "The ice," he said, which covered everything and nothing. He'd broken through a section of overflow ice on the creek shelf, the kind that forms thin and hollow and looks solid until you're on it. The toboggan had gone through first and pulled him sideways, and he'd come down hard on his left side against the creekbank stones. 2 ribs, she thought, when she got him to the bench and got his coat off and ran her hands along the damage the way her mother had taught her. The same careful pressing and listening for the hitch in his breathing. 2 ribs, at least, and a gash along his hairline that had bled freely before the cold slowed it, and something in his left shoulder that wasn't right, though he wouldn't let her push on it long enough to know exactly what. "Sit still," she said. He sat still. It was the first time he had done anything, she asked, without seeming to weigh it first, and the thought came to her sideways, the way thoughts do when you're too busy to be careful about them. He trusts me. Somewhere between the first week and the 23rd of November, Everard had decided she was someone whose hands he could trust, with the parts of himself that were broken. She didn't know how to hold that. She cleaned the gash with the alcohol he kept in the medical tin and packed it with the clean linen she'd been saving for. She didn't know what, and she wrapped his ribs with the long strip of canvas she found, rolled above the door. The kind a man who lives alone keeps because he knows someday he might need someone to wrap his ribs and there won't be anyone, so he plans around his own absence. And she told him to breathe shallowly, and he said, "I know," and she said, "I know you know. Do it anyway." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but close. He ran a fever the second night. Not a killing fever. She'd seen those, and this wasn't one. But enough that she stayed awake at the chair beside the stove, with the lamp turned low, listening to his breathing and adding wood when the fire dropped, and watching the slow rise and fall of him under the blankets she'd piled on. Somewhere around 4 in the morning he said something, half-conscious, that she didn't catch. She leaned closer. "Didn't think anyone would come," he said. For the line. She understood then. He'd been out there on the eastern creek, half in the icy water, and some part of him had understood that no one would come. That was what she heard in the words. Not self-pity, not complaint, just a fact that he'd already made his peace with. No one would come. He had set up his whole life around that fact, and built it well and stacked the woodpile high and planned for the winter, and at some point he'd just accepted that when the worst came there would be no one. She put her hand on his arm over the blanket, and she said, quietly, so as not to wake him all the way, "I came." He went still, and then he slept, and his breathing evened out, and the fever broke just before dawn. She went to the loft, and cried with her face pressed into the folded blanket, very quietly, for reasons she couldn't have itemized cleanly. Some of it was exhaustion, some of it was fear about the past 2 days. Some of it was the particular grief of realizing that you had started to care about someone's life without meaning to, and now there was no way to unstart. The weeks after were slow. He healed the way big men do, stubbornly, incompletely, refusing rest in increments, testing the damaged ribs every morning by breathing too deep until she could see him flinch. She started doing the shorter lines herself. He told her she was doing them wrong. She kept doing them her own way until her own way stopped losing snares, and after that, he didn't say anything more about it. They developed a shorthand, the way you do with anyone you're locked inside with through a northern winter. 3 knocks on the loft ladder meant the fire needed tending. 2 meant she should come down. She'd learned that he liked his coffee black and bitter, that he read the same 3 books in rotation, and had clearly read them enough times that he was reading his own margin, notes more than the text, that he slept light and woke fast, and that this was not a character flaw, but a thing that had been trained into him by years of listening for the sounds that meant something had gone wrong in the dark. She learned that his father had built this cabin. She learned that there had been a brother once. She didn't ask about the brother. He didn't offer. But the shape of the absence was there, in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and looked at a fixed point in the middle distance for a few seconds, before coming back to himself She recognized that. She had her own absences like that. People who had died or left or been failed by her. A mother, a version of a father, a younger sister who had been sent to cousins in Manitoba when the money ran out, and who she'd had no letter from in a year. That was the wound she carried quietly. Not the market at Coldwater Flats, not the $15. Her sister, Clem, 9 years old and scared of the dark and too young to understand why Sable hadn't come after her. January was the longest month. January always is. The days so short they felt like interruptions to the darkness, rather than the other way around. They played cards in the evenings, a two-person game she'd known from childhood. That he picked up fast, and they played without speaking much, because the silence by then had stopped being uncomfortable and become something they both inhabited easily. On the nights when the wind came up bad, he'd build the fire high, and she'd move her chair closer to it, and sometimes they sat close enough that she could feel the warmth off him, which was different from the warmth off the stove, and she didn't move away. She thought about it sometimes, the thing that was building between them. She thought about it the way you think about ice forming on a lake. You can see it, and you know it's real, but you can't yet say how thick it is or whether it will hold. She didn't know what he thought. He was not a man who made his thinking visible. But she noticed that when she came in from the shorter lines, her hands cold and her ears aching, he'd have her mitts warmed by the stove without being asked. She noticed that he'd started leaving the chair closest to the fire, empty in the evenings. She noticed that when she laughed at something, and she was laughing more than she'd expected, that was its own private shock. He watched her with an expression she could longing exactly. More like a man who has been so long in the dark that he's learned to be careful of the light. In February, she found the letter. It was tucked inside the cover of one of his books, the one with the worn-through spine, and she only saw it because the book fell from the shelf and the letter slipped out, and she picked it up to put it back and saw her own father's handwriting. Her father's handwriting, the loops and the backward slant of the D's unmistakable. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she read it. It was not what she'd expected. Her father had written to Everard 2 months before the market at Coldwater Flats. He had written asking. She read the word 3 times, asking Everard to take her. Not in the transaction language of the auction, asking with what sounded like the last clear thinking of a man who knew he was drowning and wanted his daughter out of the water before he went under. He had known Everard from the lumber camps, years back. He had written, "She's capable. She's smart. She doesn't deserve what's coming to her if she stays here. I can't give her money because I've got nothing left. I can give her the winter. If you take her through the winter, she'll know how to make it after." Everard had written back, yes. She set the letter down on the table. She sat with it for a long time, listening to the wind against the roof, feeling something shift in her chest that she didn't have a word for. Not betrayal exactly, not relief exactly, something in between that hurt in a specific way, and would need time to sort through. He came in from checking the lean-to, half an hour later, snow on his shoulders, and he saw her face, and he saw the letter on the table, and he went still in the doorway. She said, "You planned this," he said. "Your father asked." I agreed. You agreed to what? To keeping me? Like I was like a person who needed somewhere safe to land, he said. That's all I agreed to. Yes, he said. Just that. No justification, no rationale. Yes. She looked at him across the cabin. This man she'd spent 4 months learning, 4 months trusting with the particular caliber of trust you only build by surviving something alongside someone. And she thought about the letter, and what it cost her father to write it, and what it cost Everard to say nothing and let her come to her own understanding of the place. She thought about the fire, and the coffee, and the margins in the books, and the way he'd looked up at her from the creek bank when she'd wrapped his broken ribs, something in his face that was not quite what a man looks like when he's hired help. She said, "Do you want me here? Not because of my father, Not because of an agreement that's done. Because you want me here. He crossed the room. He stood close, not touching, just close, and he looked at her in that way he had of looking, direct and slow, and like he was choosing his words from a very short and careful list. I want you here, he said. I've wanted you here since January, and I didn't say so, because I didn't think it was something I had the right to say. The arrangement was done. You could leave in the spring. I wasn't going to make it harder. You made it harder, she said. You were kind. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Outside the snow was still coming, soft and patient, the way snow comes when it has all the time in the world. In the lean-to the horse stamped once. The fire settled. The cabin held its heat around them the way it always had. Solid, deliberate, built for exactly this kind of winter. My sister, she said. Clem, she's in Manitoba. I need to find out if she's all right. In the spring, he said. I'll help you. She believed him. That was the thing she noticed most. That she believed him without having to work at it, the way she used to have to work at believing anyone. She reached out and picked up the letter from the table. She folded it back the way it had been. She put it in the book and set the book back on the shelf. Write that down, she said. What you just told me. Say you'll help me find her. He picked up the stub of pencil from the windowsill. He turned to the back page of the worn-through book and he wrote, Find Clem, Spring. 2 words and a season. It was enough. She looked at what he'd written, and then she looked at him, and something in her that had been closed tight for 3 years opened a little. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to let the heat in. Outside, Coldwater Flats, the second longest winter in 30 years, went on blowing. But inside the cabin where Everard had built every wall himself, and stacked the wood high enough for 2, there was enough warmth for everything that needed to survive until spring.